So, welcome everyone to another CISO panel podcast. And we're excited to have everyone here today for another episode. And with us today, we have Patricia Thaine, who is co founder and CEO of Private AI. They are a Microsoft backed startup who raised a Series A led by BDC. Private AI won the Privacy Innovation Award at Picasso 2024 and was named 2023 Technology Pioneer by the World Economic Forum, as well as being a Gartner Cool Vendor. So pretty amazing stuff, Patricia. Patricia was also on Maclean's magazine Power List 2024 for being one of the top 100 Canadians shaping the country. So we'd love to learn a bit more about that as well, Patricia, as we go through. So we're going to split this into a kind of three themes for this session. One is very much a product perspective. So your vision of how you kind of built a privacy centric product, how you incorporated privacy from the start, and just your overall sort of journey and maybe even a success story that you've had. We're going to dive then into regulations. So everybody's favorite topic, but obviously incredibly important. You know, how do you become compliant? How can regulators perhaps change? Do you see gaps in existing laws with technology? And then finally, we'll round off and have a bit of a chat, particularly between you, Nithin, and Patricia, share some challenges and opportunities that founders face in the kind of cyber and privacy world for startups. So quite a lot to cover. So we'll get straight in. And Patricia, I don't know if you want to give a little bit more of an intro for yourself as well, because I gave a very quick synopsis.
Well, thanks so much, Mark. Really appreciate that and being here. A bit more of intro. My background's in research and privacy and natural language processing and speech processing, so I'm quite a bit of a nerd. And co-founded Private AI in 2019 with the purpose of building the privacy layer for software. Noticing that even the very basics of privacy weren't being done right for 80 to 90% of the data that's out there, which is unstructured data, text, audio, images, documents, namely. Can you identify the personal information within there? Can you minimize the personal information? And we're working towards actually letting people be compliant with data protection regulations when it comes to this really messy data.
Yeah. So what was your vision initially? How did you sort of come into this? Was it through a challenge you had personally in the kind of business world, or was it just an inspiration, or you saw a gap in the market? What inspired you?
It was a few different things. So the first version of Private AI was actually an implementation of homomorphic encryption, which lets you compute on encrypted data. And tried to commercialize that for about a year, realized nobody really cared. Also, the problem space for which it applied, to which the technology applied, were very slim. And so it was the typical, I'm an academic with a hammer, let me go find the nails. But throughout the process, I learned about how to find scalable problems. And when thinking about various natural language processing applications for products, realized that there was no privacy layer that I could implement, and I needed to get data in order to make these products happen. And so started thinking about what that layer would look like and realized you need to be able to often see the data. You often don't need the personal information in order to capture what it is that you need from the text or whatever other type of unstructured data you're dealing with. And there was nothing that you'd deploy on premise or within your own environment that would allow you to capture that data without that personal information that actually worked. And so started looking into that and realized this is so fundamental to any data protection regulation. How is this not solved yet? And that's what we embarked on working towards.
Amazing. What a journey. And Nithin, does that resonate with you? Is that a similar sort of approach? Is there some commonality there?
Yeah, definitely. So I think if you think about the way Klarytee thinks about this problem as well, there's a lot of overlap and commonality in terms of how we think about the privacy space. And there's a very natural sort of friendship between our two companies, I think, because of the way we see the future. But I think, Patricia, it's probably fair to say that since we both set up our startups, the world has kind of changed quite a bit when it comes to the privacy landscape, right? So you have the rapid adoption of generative AI tools in the enterprise environment. You have deployment of public cloud and SaaS applications where quite often the controls are inconsistent at best. What do you think of the future of this space? from a privacy-centric product perspective. I'd love to hear your thoughts on where you think the world is going.
Yeah, so a few things. I think that because the results of PII detection tended to be pretty hidden. It was maybe embedded into data lake solutions that they give you some idea of what's in there, but really the quality of the output wasn't particularly good. And versus now, which the risk of the output actually showing up with personal information within either your customer's environment or within your employees' environment when they didn't have access to data, the risk is taken much more seriously. And so gone are the days where band-aid solutions are enough, which is really nice to see because the amount of band-aid solutions out there of good enough, I just need to put a line in the audit or whatever report I'm sending to the regulator if wherever get caught and say that we did best practices, whatever that means for this particular system. And in addition to that, gone are the days where you can think of the unstructured data that you have as not falling under the umbrella of regulation as well, because folks tended to just put the unstructured data in a data lake and encrypt it and throw away the key. I've heard folks think that certain regulations don't apply to unstructured data, potentially because it's just so complex. And now there's just these floodgates that have opened with people wanting to take advantage of it. And now also concern for not just personal information, but confidential company information is coming up. And that's a whole new bag of worms that people need to deal with.
Yeah, and I suppose in a lot of those applications, again, one of the commonality between our products is that we see generative AI and AI more broadly as both an opportunity as well as a threat, right? Because using a lot of these tools, we can automate the identification of sensitive data, but equally that data then ends up in generative AI platforms that may limit the controls needed in a regulated environment. And often I see with customers that the accuracy of the generative AI platforms to pick up sensitive data is what they get nervous about. But of course, this is always going to be a continuum where we make the products more and more accurate. And the analogy that I always use is it's a bit like self-driving cars. You don't need them to be 100% accurate. You just need it to be more accurate than the alternative that we have, and we're already winning, right? So I'm just curious, in your experience and having worked with a lot of these LLMs around detection of sensitive data, where are you seeing the accuracy levels? Do you think we're at that tipping point where it's ready for mass market? And where do you see the challenges in terms of improving the accuracy, which I think is something that obviously private AI is very proud of in terms of the detection rates, right?
Yeah, so I don't think large language models are necessary to get high accuracy for this problem. It's really a data problem. And I will state something a little bit controversial. A lot of the problems that folks are going to try to solve with large language models, they could have solved 5 years ago. And the main issue is high quality data that has enough breadth to cover the different corner cases and that is properly annotated. And that's not going to change. That's still going to be a problem with large language models. So the accuracy that we strive towards is very high. And the way that we close the gap is by capturing more and more and more corner cases across data from multiple industries, across multiple types of data. And we tend to do so by having our customers give us feedback on the information that's output from the system. So they have to manually hand us data if there are any corner cases that they want covered, or by thorough testing and by continuously checking for any language changes, by making sure that the system is adapted for multinational data as well. For example, addresses in particular locations are different from others, or social security numbers are different from one place to another. Making sure it's taking into account disfluencies in speech. So the way that we speak isn't always my credit card number is 593524. That's a 5. No, not a 5, that's a 6. So capturing those disfluencies and errors in optical character recognition, errors in automatic speech recognition, it's a massive data problem essentially, and no amount of large language models that you throw at it will solve the problem if you don't have the right data.
Amazing.
That makes a lot of sense, yeah. And I guess the other part of that solution is really to try and implement a lot of this detection as early on in the data lifecycle as possible, right? So we had a really interesting discussion in one of our previous episodes around the concept of shift left and enabling security by design. What are your thoughts on that approach? And do you think that there is an opportunity there for private AI and tools like that to go much further left in the life cycle of the data?
Absolutely. That's the dream. And we are embedded within different products. We're embedded within different parts of the software pipeline, running as a REST API. So it's really, you put it wherever you need. But ultimately, organizations, as I'm sure you've noticed, are dealing with massive data lakes full of noise, and they have no idea what's in there. And if they just keep adding data to it, it's not going to make it better. What they can do is capture what's in their data lake at this current moment, organize it, but then going forward, start streaming the data through a personally identifiable information and confidential information identification system to keep track and minimize the data that they don't need within their data lake. So they don't have to think about it as a messy afterthought, and can keep better track of the types of data that they have for which purposes, and for example, how long they could keep that information for now that they know that there's personal information within there.
Makes a lot of sense. And you don't need to sell that to us because we're fully bought into that approach, right? But I'm just thinking, for the benefit of our listeners,
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you can elaborate a little bit around that approach and explain a little bit more on how that actually works in practice and what the benefit is for the organization, as well as the owners of the data as well, right? Because ultimately they're the most important stakeholder here.
Yeah, so think of a very practical example of you are collecting customer prompts because you want to know how the chat flow is going to work. And in these customer prompts, maybe you're a bank, maybe your customer is asking you about a loan that they received, and they're telling you all of a sudden about the health issues that they've had. You don't want that healthcare information in your systems. You can set up a flow where as soon as that information is being sent over to the large language model, it gets stripped out. And if it's personal information like healthcare information that you don't want in your systems, you could never store it in your systems, and then it's never going to be a problem.
Yeah, and I think that is an incredibly powerful way to think about security because you're really removing the reliance on the infrastructure to provide the security and building the controls into the data itself to enable the use of these really exciting technologies without security getting in the way. So I do think that that's an infinitely more practical and scalable approach to addressing the privacy and security problems.
Yeah. And how are you thinking about that shift left approach?
Yes, absolutely. Sorry.
How are you thinking about it?
Sorry, I missed the question. Yeah, so yeah, I think we're thinking in a very similar way. So if we can get as close to the source of the data as possible and apply the controls at the point where the data is actually generated, then that's got to be the most effective way. And I guess the key difference for us is we're really integrating into the applications itself. So we launched our product on Microsoft Office, for instance, so that we can be embedded into the workflow of the user so the user doesn't have to change the way they're actually doing something. Because again, I think the other important aspect of security is around enabling users to do what they naturally do without expecting them to change their behavior. And I think that's really important as well. So that's the piece that we're really looking at around the integrating of these technologies into the enterprise application so we can go as far left as
Amazing. What I find fascinating is the technology is moving so fast, and as we know, right, and just just this year, some of the advances that we've seen come out. Shifting gears a little bit, are the regulators keeping up? And Patricia, I'd love to just hear your views, the current state of the regulators, whether that's payments or privacy, and, what they could be doing better or how people can work with them or address them, because I know you've got a lot of views on that.
Yeah. Well, a lot of folks will claim that regulators aren't keeping up. But I'd say to the contrary, a lot of these regulations, like the GDPR, are more forward thinking, and the technology just does not exist yet to comply with them. So you could do your best and showcase that you did best practices. But yeah, we're working towards creating that ability to actually be compliant with those regulations. But some fundamental aspects of it are solvable. And what I have seen is confusion around what kind of technologies are the ones that you should be using for complying with these regulations. I've seen folks not understand how complicated it is to actually comply with the regulations and think that checkbox compliance is enough. And that's something that you don't necessarily see with regulations like HIPAA or PCI DSS, because they are very clear on what it is that you have to do with the data. And they are very strict and on what happens if you don't do the right thing with the data. So PCI DSS, you have to be really cautious with the credit card information that you keep and how you keep it. Often tokenization is required. And you have to delete the actual credit card numbers that are being sent to you, right? So if you, for example, are an insurance company with a data lake and you have somebody sending you credit card information that's scribbled on the side of a piece of paper, and all of a sudden you have to be concerned about that piece of information that was sent to you. And it's very clear, if you don't do this, there are massive consequences. In HIPAA, if you don't properly de-identify information, either under HIPAA Safe Harbor or doing expert determination, which is the preferred method, which calculates the re-identification risk and shows that it's under the acceptable re-identification risk threshold, then you cannot use your data for secondary purposes like research. And so this clarity has led to, in the healthcare space, much better innovation because people know what it is that they could do with their data. And it also has led to better privacy controls, fewer band-aid solutions out there. I'm not saying they don't exist and that people don't sometimes use them, but it's much less. And it gives people the confidence, especially when they have that stamp of approval from an expert determiner, to go ahead and feel comfortable with what they're doing with their data. And that's something that you don't have with other regulations. And so would love to see that transfer over to other verticals as well.
I suppose the flip side of the regulation argument is that organizations quite often, especially if they don't have a sophisticated compliance function, they get quite terrified about the implication of getting it wrong, and they go the extreme in the other direction, right? And they just lock everything down so that it becomes completely unusable. Do you see a lot of that, especially in the healthcare space, given that you do a lot of work there, that sort of concern around getting things wrong? Or do you think that actually the balance is right?
Only in locations where the healthcare regulation isn't clear about what you have to do. And I see that under the GDPR as well. Folks are concerned about getting it wrong. And one thing that's required under the GDPR is having a data protection officer, right, in your organization, or somebody acting as a data protection officer. But oftentimes, what organizations will do is basically put them aside in an office, and they're the person stamping things, and not the person who's intricately embedded into your organization, trying to understand how your technical systems work and how the law can be integrated into making you a successful company. With the data processes that you have. The organizations that have done this the best are the ones who empower their data protection officers to go and understand the technology and empower the engineers from a bottom up to call something out if they think there should be a privacy protection in place and who encourage shift left approaches.
That makes a lot of sense because I think a lot of this is about culture as much as compliance, right? So building that culture early on into the company where everybody takes responsibility for doing the right thing, then makes it much easier to be compliant without having to lock everything down and prevent productivity. So that makes a lot of sense, and that's pretty consistent with what we see as well. But where do you see some of the gaps with the regulation? So, given that you work across a lot of different regulated sectors, I believe that you operate in financial services and government and healthcare, and I probably missed a few there as well. So, I'd love to get your thoughts around where you think there are major gaps with the regulatory framework at the moment, both in terms of industries as well as maybe some geographies you've worked with where you see things working a lot better than others. So yeah, would love your insights on that.
I'd say the main gaps are lack of clarity in certain regulations like the GDPR of what counts as anonymized data, for example. And then lack of regulatory bodies to actually enforce the regulations. So it seems like mainly the fines tend to go to folks that have done egregious harms, like the Cambridge Analytica issue with Meta, for example, and the massive fines that the EU is trying to make them pay or has charged them with. There just aren't enough people to go through every organization's systems and see whether or not they're doing the right thing. But there's also not there isn't the framework in place to tell them what the right thing is. It's basically you go and figure it out. Each individual organization go and figure it out. And then the regulators, if you get charged with something, will be the judges of whether you did the right thing. So it's very much it's a little scary, right? If you have no framework that's provided by the regulators to go and do and set up your systems, and you just have to cross your fingers that they like what you did.
This is a particularly significant problem for businesses that are building new products, right? Because you don't even know where to start with the regulations and which ones you need to comply with. So, given that you've now reached a fairly mature stage in terms of your product, I'd love to hear about how you actually managed that initial phase where you had a concept, but you had to navigate through this incredibly complex regulatory framework and make decisions around how to prioritize where you invest into the product.
Yeah, great question. So we make sure that as much as possible we remove any personal information that's real from the data we use for training our models. And so we don't personally store any credit card information, though we have models to identify credit card information, for example. But that's all synthetic data that we've created out of many order cases over the years. It I'd say that data minimization aspect really helps. We aren't concerned about if our data set leaks. We're not concerned about the information of the individuals leaking. We're concerned about our IP. That's it's harmful to us, but at least it's not harmful to whoever would have otherwise been in the data set. And I think that that's a practice that a lot of organizations can implement they if they put in a tiny bit of legwork. It's the product's out there. They can use it, right? They don't have to build it themselves. They don't have to spend millions of dollars like we have to build it themselves. So they could deal with this fairly straightforwardly, understanding their data from the very beginning.
And it sounds like it's actually all about building good foundations instead of just focusing on a specific regulation, trying to get the foundations right so that actually when you do need to comply with the regulation, you already have the basic principles in place that allow you to comply without having to change too much.
Yeah, that's a great way of putting it.
That's pretty consistent with our view of the world as well. A lot of these principles around data security and making sure that you share data on a need-to-know basis and in a granular way. All of these kind of things, even when you look at the new world of generative AI and all of these tools being used in the workplace, they don't pose any new threats, right? It's just about getting the basics right more consistently in order to avoid the increased number of threats that you're facing in a more consistent way. So a lot of people ask me about what are the new threats because of generative AI. And the reality is there probably isn't any, right? It's just that we're just seeing a higher volume of the same threats that we had before, and we just need to do things better, more consistently. But it's the same things that we were always doing even before the dawn of generative AI.
Yeah, they are just more pervasive. That's true. Regardless of whether you have a model that's large or not, if you were training it on your unstructured data, that would have been an issue regardless if it was going to spew information out. Though I'd say there are a few cases where there are threats that people don't necessarily understand, like the fact that RAG embeddings can contain personal information and confidential data, and so they need to be careful about the contextual data they're using to create those. They might not necessarily understand the propensity of memorization of information from fine-tuning data that they might be using. And so it's more of an educational issue, in addition to the good foundations that you mentioned.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. So the product you're building, it's obviously operating in a very complex space. So in the early days, I'd love to hear what were the biggest challenges you faced as a founder when you were building the early versions of the product and how you managed to scale it to the level that you've got it to. And again, for the benefit of our founders, I'd love for you to share the story of private AI so far as well, and how you got to where you got to.
Yeah, I guess. It's been a journey. The very first part was figuring out who needed the technology in the first place at that point in time, and so the having the early adopters who would need it so much that they didn't care that we were a 3-person company, and we found that in the conversational AI space early on, for removing PCI information for complying with PCI DSS. And the accuracy had to be very, very high because the customers were able to see the results of the redaction. And that's always when folks have the highest bar when it comes to accuracy, if their customers can see what's going on. And so if you are a customer who is being promised that your data is being anonymized when it's sent over to a vendor, you could double check, and then all of a sudden it's no longer checkbox territory. They actually have to show you that they're doing the best possible, they're taking the best possible care of your data. So we discovered that in that space, there were quite a few players who needed this technology who didn't want to build it themselves because it wasn't their core technology. And so many of the major automatic speech recognition companies and communications platforms are now using our technology as the basis for their redaction and sometimes conversational intelligence as well, because as a result, we have very accurate named entity recognition too. And then next came the figuring out how to expand into enterprise. And so we started figuring out what enterprise problems folks had that were more urgent. Namely, if they had a cybersecurity breach and needed a really accurate assessment of their data, the current providers that they had did not get them the accuracy that they needed. And so they'd have to spend months and a lot of money on this problem. And so we could just go in there and scan the data lake that may have been compromised and provide that report very, very quickly. And in other cases, folks wanted to get data to their data science teams, and without that personal information. So it was really about unlocking development data for their teams to be able to train models with, for their teams to be able to test their systems with as well. And Yeah, I guess it's been quite the journey because there's just so many different use cases across so many different industries. And so finding that repeatable buyer has been a little bit difficult because everybody wants something different out of the tool. Yeah, I don't know if you experienced that as well with your product, but there's a myriad of different things you could do with it. And marketing it for solutions when there's so many different solutions can be overwhelming to folks within companies.
Yeah, and I think that differentiator point that was going to be my next question because it is such a crowded space, right? And I remember when I was building my first startup, especially in Europe, it was quite a novel thing to do. So you could pick up the phone and call any exec in any large enterprise, and they would actually answer the phone because they thought it was so exciting to speak to somebody that was building a startup. Whereas now nowadays, it's such a popular thing to do that execs get inundated with emails, phone calls, LinkedIn messages, and so on. So making your voice heard and differentiating yourself in a very crowded space, we always find that that's always a challenge. And especially if you're building something pretty technical and pretty foundational, then that becomes a really difficult challenge in the early days. How have you gone about navigating that problem, and how have you stayed so focused on your vision for the product in what's a very, very noisy industry?
Yeah, the North Star is really allowing people to understand their data better and allowing people to minimize the risk and allowing people to also do so in a way that makes the most out of the data that they can keep. And we have the way that we stay focused is maintaining that North Star regardless of who it is that we're selling to, because everybody needs those three components uh, in multiple places within their organization. And the way that we differentiate ourselves within the noise is one, I think we're one of the very, very few, if not the only one, who has a demo that's working on their website that people could just play with and see that we're not gaslighting them with regards to the accuracy of our technology. That has made a big difference, encouraging people to play with it hands on. It's also we encourage developers to play with it as well. So you could get a free API key on our website, start playing with it right away. I find that oftentimes when it comes to systems that are these core technical systems, either they don't work very well or it's unclear whether they work very well and they're kind of hiding behind a lot of smoke screens. So that's one thing. Another thing is we tend to really focus on high quality educational material. And so we put out a lot of information about what privacy concerns are fundamental for different types of technologies, how you should be thinking about different regulations and data minimization. And that educational piece is actually really, really key because oftentimes we're talking to people who don't understand the difficulty of building this technology themselves. That we often have to have build versus buy discussions, or understand it, but are really having a hard time explaining to their own C-suite why this is an important problem to solve. And so what we're working towards there is really equipping them with the information that they need in order to make a case, in order for folks to understand the actual risks behind not taking care of this problem for the specific use cases that they're dealing with. How are you dealing with it?
Yeah, I mean, we're still experimenting with a lot of different approaches. So I do think that building a community around some of the topics that we care about a lot, like for instance, this podcast series, has really helped us define what our key messages are and what our brand stands for, and that's been really valuable. But we're still very early in our journey, so we're still trying to figure out a lot of these things. But we often get feedback from our customers saying that, when we first met, we thought you were doing something completely different to what you're doing. So we know that it's got to be a continuous learning approach where we're constantly refining it. And, I can't say that we definitely got it right yet, but I think it's something that we're learning about every day. But I do think that communities are important and building support networks of people that share your vision, that's really the way that we're trying to address that problem.
That's a good strategy. And you'll get it right for maybe a few months, and then the market will change and you'll have to get it right all over again.
Exactly.
Patricia, just going back to what you mentioned about build versus buy, where do you get the sense the market is now, particularly for the enterprise folks? Are they really looking at innovators to come in now and help them, or are they still trying to build sort of empires of their own technology stack, or is it a bit of both, or does it depend on which industry? We'd just love to get your thoughts on where we're at with that.
I'd say it depends on each individual organization and their culture. There are still some crazy ones trying to build everything themselves, and yeah, that's always interesting. We've had a few folks come to us and say, "Oh, we could do this with a large language model," and then they come back to us and say, "Okay, it was a lot harder than we thought it was once we put it in production." Because the confusion is it'll work with a few toy examples, but then they won't see all of the corner cases that are many, many, many when they're dealing with real world data. So the way that we deal with build versus buy is really showcasing these are some of the questions that our team has to grapple with on a day-to-day basis. These are some of the questions that they ask when they're adapting the system for different languages, and now scale this up to every single entity type that you need to deal with. These are the product choices we've had to make and the optimizations we've had to make for the models to run efficiently in your systems, because large language models are not going to be able to process all of that data that you have in a way that's scalable and that's going to not cost you a ton of money. So and also the maintenance of the system is something that we point out. The fact that you will have your engineers churn, right? They will at some point leave. Who's going to maintain the system after that? And that is a big pain point within folks who build their own systems, where the system that they're building isn't a core component of their business. It could just fall by the wayside, and this isn't something you want falling by the wayside.
Amazing. Thank you. Also, another question. Obviously, people can go to private AI website, get a ton of information there. How do you keep up to speed with things personally? Are there like blogs you follow? Is there sort of industry gurus? Because things are moving so fast. Have you got sort of resources that people can tap into?
Let's see. So I mostly follow some folks on LinkedIn in the industry. I always love following Michelle Dennedy, for example, and her insights. There are quite a few. Sheila Jambikar, I like having conversations with her. The chief privacy officer at Dayforce and was at Twilio. She did a good chunk of their GDPR compliance program, and she's always brilliant to talk to. So if you could follow her, that's great too. While things are moving quickly, they're not actually moving that quickly. I think it's a lot of noise, and the fundamental technology is still very similar. The problems are still very similar. If you don't have the right data tooling, you're not going to get very far. And a lot of the questions folks are still working on addressing and will be working on addressing for years to come.
Obviously, the Klarytee CISO panel is on the top of your list as well, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent. Well, I think that probably brings us to a nice conclusion. And just want to thank you for your time, Patricia, and likewise, Nithin. It's been really insightful. What we'll do is, as well, we'll write up some notes from the show and some resources for people, some links and so on. Yeah, thanks again for your time. It's been wonderful. And if people are watching this, please subscribe as well, because we get some more exciting speakers coming up. So yeah, it's been a real pleasure. So thank you, Patricia.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Patricia.
Thank you. It was fun.